Hello, I'm Janusz Lewiński and you're watching World News Tonight. Massive crowds of mourners paid their tribute to the late Pope Francis at St. Peter's Square, with the world's political elite coming together to honor the pontiff's legacy. On the sidelines of the solemn ceremony, however, another chapter in the quest for peace in Ukraine has taken place, with Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Donald Trump talking face-to-face about the shape of things to come. More on that in just a moment, but first, here is the latest headlines. Greek government grilled over Russian shadow fleet. Cybersecurity in the spotlight ahead of Poland's elections. And Georgia's new migration law raises eyebrows. Hundreds of thousands arrived at the Vatican today to bid farewell to Pope Francis, who passed away on the 21st of April at the age of 88. From royalty and heads of state to ordinary members of the public, everyone present on St. Peter's Square paid tribute to what is already being hailed as a historical pontificate.
The guiding thread of his mission was also the conviction that the Church is a home for all, a home with its doors always open.
It is really amazing to be part of so many people who have come to say bye-bye to their daddy, the Pope.
It was a very special person, the way he wanted to treat the people, and it's not really necessary to be religious to appreciate this.
And joining us here today with more on this story is our special correspondent, Alex Kadir. Alex, what can you tell us about this ceremony? Did it reflect the Pope's often unconventional attitude towards tradition?
Well, good evening from the very heart of the Vatican. I'm going to bring you what we understand to be some of Pope Francis's last words to give you a sense of his character and that character that really showed throughout his papacy. Those words were recalled by Massimiliano Strapetti, who was the Pope's nurse, who accompanied him around St. Peter's Square behind me on Easter Sunday. The last time the world was able to see the Pope, he wished the assembled crowd a happy Easter, and after returning back to his apartments, he turned to his nurse and said, "Thank you for bringing me back to the square." Well, now 250,000 people came from around the world to that same square to say farewell to Pope Francis. And as you said, his wishes were for a more simplified ceremony, and we saw that reflected particularly in his coffin, a very simple wood, zinc-lined wooden coffin, which was shown to those 250,000 people assembled here. Extremely moving scenes, people praying, people in tears, very much upset by the death of the late pontiff, but also very much wanting to celebrate his papacy. Just over a year ago, he, on Holy Thursday, washed the feet of female inmates in Italy. Before that, he had done the same thing on Holy Thursday for Muslim refugees. Little symbols which meant a lot to a lot of people. He was also now the first pope to be buried outside of the Vatican for more than 100 years. His body now lies in the papal Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore, which is just a few kilometers from here. His tomb simply says in Latin, Franciscus, his name. That is the legacy he leaves behind for so many people here. He was a progressive pope, a reforming pope who brought women to positions of leadership. But clearly today he also brought diplomats together. He possibly created a situation where history could be made for peace in Ukraine. I'm sure we'll hear more on that from our correspondent in Kiev. But clearly today has been about bidding farewell to Pope Francis. Many have prayed, many have mourned, all have said goodbye.
Alex Kadir joining us from the Vatican. Alex, thank you very much for bringing us this latest update and the statement on the legacy of the late Pope Francis. Now, Ukraine's leader Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke to US President Donald Trump for about 15 minutes at the Vatican on the sidelines of the pontiff's funeral ceremony. The meeting, referred to as productive and very symbolic by the US and Ukrainian sides respectively, comes at a time of tense relations between the two countries as the US continues to hammer out a potential deal between Ukraine and Russia. For more on this story, we're now joined by our correspondent in Kiev, Oz Kateji. Oz, the images of this meeting are already being labelled as iconic. But looking beyond the imagery, are there any specifics regarding the path towards peace in Ukraine?
Well, look, this is the first meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy since that ill-fated evening in the White House Oval Office that was broadcast around the world. And this seems certainly to have gone better, according to both sides. The White House press spokesman said that the meetings were very productive, whereas Zelenskyy posted the photos that you're seeing on your screen now of them sitting together inside the Vatican and having this one-on-one. He said, "Good meeting, one-on-one. We managed to discuss a lot, and we hope for a result for all. The things that we have spoken about." So Zelenskyy there sounds very hopeful that there is going to be progress on the things that he discussed with Trump in this meeting. Now, interestingly, Trump also posted following and struck a very different tone from the message he's been striking over the last few weeks. Whenever he's been asked about peace, he's repeatedly said that he sees both leaders as wanting peace. Now, after this discussion with Zelenskyy, and a post by Donald Trump on his Truth Social account says, "It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me, and he has to be dealt with differently." And he mentioned banking sanctions against Putin. He was referring there to the attacks that Putin made over the last couple of weeks, particularly the one in Kyiv that have killed so many civilians. Donald Trump referring to those and saying that potentially because of those, maybe Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. Now, whether this results in a policy change for Ukraine, it remains to be seen. But this is definitely a different sounding tone from what we've heard from Donald Trump in the last few weeks. So as far as Kyiv's concerned, that will be some sort of diplomatic progress at this funeral.
Oz Kateji joining us from Kiev with the latest on the peace process between Ukraine and Russia. Oz, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. Now, disturbing new facts have emerged regarding Russia's so-called shadow fleet, made up of decommissioned oil tankers used for dodging international sanctions. A group of MEPs has demanded answers from the government in Athens after discovering that Russia has purchased a large percentage of these vessels from Greek businesses. Kazimierz Łysiak has this report.
They're often moving in full sunlight, and yet they are dubbed a shadow fleet. Their cover comes not from the lack of sun, but rather from using shady tactics in order to avoid detection and legal consequences. Russia's infamous shadow fleet consists of old decommissioned vessels which circumvent Western sanctions in order to sell Russian oil and gas. But where are these ships purchased at? According to a group of more than 30 members of the European Parliament, Greece is one of the biggest culprits.
We were struck to learn that Greek owners are by far the largest sellers of ships for Russia's shadow fleet. According to a Brookings report based on Bloomberg data, 37% of the 75 Russian shadow fleet oil tankers sanctioned by the US in January 2025 were previously owned by Greek owners.
That's an excerpt from a letter sent by a cross-party group of MEPs from Lithuania, Poland, Germany, France, the Netherlands and more to the Prime Minister of Greece, Kyriakos Mitsotakis. The MEPs demand an explanation and concrete action to stop Greek businessmen from supporting the shadow fleet.
We still think that the Greek government could take more responsibility in preventing further sales of ships, but also in trying to track down the owners who did own the ships or still are involved, possibly in the ownership or in the management of the ships. But it is a broader problem because governments still are too late and too weak in taking responsibility of preventing the circumvention of the sanctions that are still very important to keep the pressure on Russia.
The Greek government has so far responded through a spokesperson with a short statement.
The Greek authorities are doing everything to ensure compliance with the sanctions and to prevent any circumvention of the sanctions in their territory.
The shadow fleet has generated $9.4 billion of revenue for Russia in 2024 alone, according to the Kyiv School of Economics. These energy exports are not only fueling countries, but also the Russian war machine in Ukraine.
Official energy export is now sanctioned already for 3 years, and 3 years ago there was the idea that that would be actually lethal for Russia and that this would quickly end the war because Russia would run out of money. But then Russia found a way around these regulations.
The shadow fleet tankers can also be used to smuggle other goods, not just oil or gas. On Friday, the Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, seized a ship suspected of carrying Ukrainian grain stolen by Russia. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łyszak.
Now, as Poland gears up for next month's presidential elections, state officials voice increasing concerns over fake narratives and disinformation. Is Warsaw ready to push back against potential attempts to interfere with Poland's democratic process? Sasha Farbach reports.
Poland heads towards its crucial elections just a few weeks away. A familiar threat looms large: election interference. And the likely culprit, the Kremlin. Various nation-state actors, including Russia, Belarus, and China, are intensifying efforts to destabilize Poland's political landscape, with disinformation at the forefront. False narratives are spreading to create division and mistrust, turning the election into a battleground for truth. The Polish government is doing its utmost to prepare for any threats.
We have built an institutionally important project designed to ensure election security at various levels, such as protecting the IT systems of the National Electoral Office, countering disinformation, and informing candidates' election committees about incidents.
Amid recent disinformation campaigns on social media during Romania's elections and Russian interference in other elections across Europe, politicians and security officials remain on high alert to counter the Kremlin's tactics.
The Russian Federation trying to get access to the control system of a public service with whatever intention. I mean, it's the first time we observed it to this level. Besides the examples of major cyber attacks on political parties and companies of public transportation, those were all more or less next to the European elections.
As citizens and governments are stepping up, experts warn that social media platforms are dropping the ball when it comes to their responsibilities in tackling disinformation.
Primarily it's Russia, but then there is social media platforms. They are withdrawing from the tools that were previously developed and from practices on countering disinformation. So the situation is going to be even worse.
The challenge ahead is acute. According to a recent report in Poland, it highlights a shift in how people access information. 81% of respondents acknowledge a surge in online disinformation over the past decade. Surprisingly, 35% of Poles now rely on alternative sources for news, while nearly half, around 46%, turn to social media as their main source for breaking news. Experts warn that although much is being done to counter disinformation,
we saw some, for example, fake accounts of Polish candidates. And we were able to remove them.
Nation-state actors and false narratives will continue in the near future.
We saw, for example, not directed to the Polish infosphere, but to English-speaking audiences, content pieces that were pretending to be media outlets, for example, Polish media outlets, but not only, also CNN, that were spreading false information about potential terrorist threats in Poland, and that would lead, falsely, obviously, to postponing the elections. I would expect these disinformation threat actors to be more present and more active 2 weeks before elections.
As Poland stays alert and its government works to safeguard the election process, citizens must also stay cautious. Russia and other nations will continue to target our digital hearts and minds in their efforts to influence the outcome. Sasha Farbach, TVP World.
In Georgia, the government is facing questions over a new migration law, changing admission rules for citizens of several developing countries. Yet the real source of the changes may lie elsewhere, as the souring of relations with the European Union may have led the pro-Russian administration in Tbilisi to desperately seek new investors in the Middle East. Piotr Miszczuk reports.
The government announcement that migrants from 17 countries, including Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Nigeria, will be allowed to enter Georgia if they hold a visa or residence permit from the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait or Oman, astounded many a media outlet in the country and beyond.
Citizens of 17 more countries have the opportunity to enter Georgia without a visa. The change will come into force from May 16th.
In response to the media backlash, the pro-Russian government of the Georgian Dream Party said in a statement that the new legislation will in fact tighten the rules of entering the country.
Citizens of the listed countries had the right to enter Georgia even before the amendments were made. In case if they held a visa or a residence permit from the Persian Gulf countries, although the validity period of the visa was not defined. Therefore, the requirements for the mentioned countries have been tightened.
Experts say the media did misinterpret the initial information. It turns out that for some people access to the country will be more difficult, while for others easier.
For 11 countries it's easier. For 5 or 6 it's more complicated.
According to experts, the real motivation behind the move is Georgia's willingness to lure investors from the Gulf states amid its worsening relations with the EU. Many Western countries pulled back from Georgia following the disputed election in October last year and a crackdown on NGOs. Now Georgia seems to be in search of alternatives.
If the Gulf countries will actually invest in Georgia, it is highly expected that they will be trying to bring their own workforce to the country to implement the projects that they will be investing into.
This might allow Gulf countries to carry out projects in Georgia that are akin to the building of football stadiums for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, which, according to The Guardian, led to 6,500 deaths of workers from poor countries, including countries specified in the amendment.
And in case of Bangladesh citizens and Pakistan citizens, it might be their willingness and readiness to work in the worse conditions under much lower income than of Georgians.
One might think that Georgia is diversifying the sources of its foreign direct investment, not to become overly dependent upon Russia, but experts say the ruling Georgian Dream adopted a more practical approach.
They seem to realize that Russian money is not enough to sustain the country, especially when the Western assistance is immensely decreasing, considering their anti-democratic actions. So I think they're just trying to fill up the holes from any source they can find.
The European Union has not responded to the planned legislation yet, but there are some concerns that migrants from developing countries might pour into the EU through Georgia. Should this fear become more real, the bloc could lift the existing visa-free travel for Georgians to its member states.
39 years ago, a major safety breach led to the catastrophic meltdown of the Soviet nuclear plant in Chernobyl, now part of Ukraine. Already a poignant memento of the deadly consequences of negligent handling of nuclear power, the events of that day are now in the spotlight once more, following the reckless Russian military activities in the area during the ongoing war of aggression. Sonia Gatabishyan reports.
Saturday marks the 39th anniversary of Ukraine's Chernobyl power plant disaster, the worst civilian nuclear accident ever. On that day, the facility operators ignored safety measures during a test, causing a power surge which led to an explosion and fire that destroyed a reactor.
When there was the nuclear meltdown and it caused several people to lose their lives, this radioactive material went outside of the facility and it was carried in the region by the clouds, and that was the problem.
31 facility workers and firemen died, mainly from acute radiation sickness, and thousands later fell to radiation-related illnesses, such as cancer. The entirety of 50,000 residents of Pripyat, a town just 3 kilometers from the plant, were completely evacuated in the first hours. A few months later, the Soviet Union built a structure around a damaged reactor to contain radiation, which was later replaced by an improved confinement in 2019. According to the United Nations, the new shield would make the reactor area stable and environmentally safe for 100 years. That is, if it wasn't for a February Russian drone strike that punched a hole in the shield and...
Sealing the hole hasn't been possible because it sits above the crumbling sarcophagus that encases radioactive debris from the reactor.
The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is currently assessing the damage. But nuclear energy encompasses more than just a legacy of Chernobyl. Recognizing its potential as a reliable, low-carbon energy source, Poland is building its first nuclear power plant. According to the Polish Deputy Industry Minister, the first reactor is expected by 2035, and in 2036 nuclear energy is anticipated to start flowing into the grid.
Nuclear is a dispatchable capacity that can guarantee to the Polish energy system zero emission dispatchable capacity, and as a consequence guarantee stability of supply, and that is why we are developing nuclear.
The Polish government secured 192 billion Polish zloty, that is nearly 45 billion euro, to construct Poland's first nuclear power plant. The project is expected to boost Polish economy by engaging Polish companies in the design and construction process. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabiszczyn.
With powerful images of the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting emerging from the Vatican today, the focus is once more on the difficult balancing act that is the Ukraine-Russia peace process. Yet with few details officially confirmed and issues such as control over Crimea still causing major tensions, some say the balance is about to tip in favor of Russia, the aggressor in this conflict. Are we really close to a lasting peace deal? And also, on what terms? Joining us now is Bogdan Nachajlo, editor-in-chief at the Kiev Post. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening, everybody.
So we've experienced many false dawns in this regard, but do you think that what President Zelenskyy said following the meeting with Trump could be a signal that perhaps a positive solution is on the horizon after all?
I think that he was putting a gloss on the meeting. Look, it's their first meeting since the scandalous meeting in the White House. They made an effort to touch base again. But what is important is that Trump saw that Zelenskyy was embraced by other leaders of the West, particularly Macron and the French and the British Prime Minister. He left rather suddenly. And he sent his first message on the plane where, there was a diatribe against American media being critical of him. But the bottom line was that Putin is not delivering and that maybe it's time to be more forceful with him. It's the first signal, if you want, that Trump is beginning to have second thoughts about Volodymyr Putin in Moscow delivering on what he expects.
Yes, I mean, what Trump said specifically was, and I quote, "It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently through banking or secondary sanctions." Could this actually be what follows in this regard, especially if Ukraine decides to sign the minerals deal, leaving Russia as the one country that seemingly doesn't want this peace process to go anywhere?
Look, we don't know what's going to happen. Zelenskyy has played it quite tough in the last week. He said, no, we're not going to stand on our knees before you, the US, however important you are. And this means both Crimea, giving away territory, and the minerals deal. And I think that given the very difficult responses emerging from Moscow, or lack of responses, plus the support that Trump witnessed today in Rome from European leaders for Zelenskyy in Ukraine, I think this has made Trump backtrack somewhat. Look, Trump is very unpredictable. We don't know if he's, a balanced force. He says one thing, he can say something tomorrow. But on the plane, he's obviously angry. He's obviously disappointed that at least Putin hasn't given him something to show that his line is correct. And now he's being forced to reconsider somewhat, for today at least, for tomorrow. It doesn't mean he's going to change his policy. But as of today, on his return from Rome, he's having second thoughts, perhaps.
Yet also, as of this day, we still have the semi-official position that territorial concessions will be necessary. We don't really know what it means for Crimea. Will it be de facto control or actually a legal handover to Russia? But what would it mean to Ukraine at this stage? I mean, isn't this something of a deal breaker still? Will Ukraine be ready to change its tack on that?
Ukraine, or rather its leadership, is not ready. Zelensky has made it very clear, no, we are not going to give Crimea away simply because you Americans are in league with Moscow and you want this to be, shall we say, an accommodation that suits you both. No. There is international law to consider. There's the Charter of the UN. It's not a question of the US dictating anymore. And also, very importantly, as Zelensky has made it clear, it's the Ukrainian people through its constitution and through its parliament that decides these things. We're not into Trumpism here or into Putinism. There is law, international law, there is domestic law, and there are procedures to be followed. Zelensky cannot simply sign away Crimea or sign away part of eastern Ukraine. That's not on the cards. And he's made that very clear, courageously, in the given circumstances. He's also said, in terms of the mineral deal, no, you're not going to just walk away in some extortionist deal imposed on us. These are not colonial times of the 19th century. So, you know, Trump has a lot to think about. And he's got mounting concern at home over his policies, but he's got the support of most of Europe behind Zelensky too, and the population support in Ukraine behind Zelensky.
Let's consider the alternative scenario then, one what was actually hinted at by the US administration, specifically the peace negotiations collapsing and the US walking away. What would this mean for Ukraine and for the military support for Ukraine as Russia continues its relentless attacks against civilian and military targets all across the country?
Obviously, it's not good news. It's not what Ukraine wants or needs. But the Ukrainian people are saying louder and louder that even if tomorrow we are forced to resort to guerrilla warfare, we will fight for our freedom. And we're not going to be walked over by an imperialist aggressor state in league with a former ally of Ukraine. The hope is that Europe will be galvanized and will precipitate its support, not just in words, but in actions in terms of military support for Ukraine. That is the hope. And certainly the signals that are being given by the leaders of France, Britain, the new Chancellor of Germany, Scandinavia, Poland and the Baltic states show that Europe is united behind Ukraine and that Ukraine is not on its own as Trump would like it to appear.
Do you think it's safe to say that the US is, as you're saying, in league with Russia on that? Or is it simply the result of a strategy, whether it's going to work or not, it's impossible to say, that the US wants to align Russia against China? Because this seems to be the general idea in the broader perspective there.
Look, things are still unclear. As I said at the outset, Trump is very unpredictable, and he's not a seasoned player in the diplomatic sense. You don't know what he's going to say tomorrow or the day after or the day after. But China is clearly not interested in Ukraine being obliterated, of Russia taking over. Remember, Ukraine was China's main trading partner before the war started. It was its main channel, its main conduit into Western Europe. And I'm sure that China does not want to see Russia take over the Black Sea, nor does Turkey for that matter. And for that reason, strategically, politically, might make sense for China to be seen to be aligned to Moscow. But at the end of the day, they don't want Trump to walk away with but Putin to walk away with a victory from this situation. And for that matter, Trump, because China is under attack the economic sanctions that are effectively being imposed on China. This is not something that China is warming to. And in the meantime, it may want to make common league with Europe vis-a-vis Trump, rather than sort of sit it out and let Trump have his own way in collusion with the person in Moscow.
Bogdan Nakhaylo was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Minash Ravinsky. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us for more latest news and updates.